I expected my morning coffee to be interrupted by the screech of brakes and a muffled shout. The mug almost slipped from my hand as I rushed to the window. On the corner of the street stood a man, frozen in place, just inches from the car's hood. The driver rolled down his window, spat a few choice words, and sped off, leaving the man shaking on the curb. I don't know what made me react so quickly. Before I even realized what I was doing, I had thrown on a jacket and was out the door. My heart raced as I crossed the street, my sneakers slapping against the asphalt.
Hey,
I shouted, waving to get his attention. His wide, startled eyes met mine, still reflecting the raw panic he felt. "Are you okay?" I asked. He nodded, but his hands told a different story. They trembled so violently, I thought he might drop the small bag he was clutching. His clothes were a mess, and his shoes were barely holding together. But there was something in his posture, a quiet defiance, that made me hesitate. "Come on," I said, offering my hand. "Let's get you out of the street." He hesitated, eyeing my hand like it was foreign. Eventually he took it, and his grip was surprisingly firm. We walked toward the sidewalk, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. "You're lucky that car stopped in time," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "You might have given me a heart attack," he replied. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and his shoulders relaxed a little. "I guess I should thank you," he said in a low, raspy voice like he hadn't used it much. "You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did," I replied without thinking. "You look like you needed someone to step in." We stood there for a moment, caught in the intensity of what had just happened and unsure of what to say next. Then, on a whim, I blurted out, "Want to come in for coffee?" His eyes widened, and I could see the internal battle. He wasn't sure if he could trust me. I didn't blame him. Inviting a stranger inside was as unusual as accepting the invitation. But there was something about him, an unspoken pull I couldn't explain. "I live just over there," I added quickly, pointing to my house. "It's not far." He rubbed the back of his neck, scanning the street as if searching for a way out. But then he nodded. "All right."
just for a little while.
As we walked toward my house, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me hyper-aware of how hesitant his steps were. The morning air felt sharp against my skin, and my chest fluttered with an odd sense of anticipation. I couldn't shake the feeling that inviting him in was the start of something far bigger than I could understand. Inside, the warmth of my kitchen felt almost overwhelming after the crisp morning air. I gestured for him to sit while I got the coffee going. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched him. He seemed out of place, scanning the room like he was memorizing every detail. "Milk? Sugar?" I asked, setting a steaming mug in front of him. "Just black," he muttered, wrapping his fingers around the cup as if absorbing its warmth. We sat in silence for a few moments, the only sounds being the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I wanted to ask him everything, where he was from, how he'd ended up like this, but I didn't want to push. Instead, I waited, hoping he'd open up when he was ready. "It's been a while since I've had this," he said, finally lifting the mug to his lips. "A real coffee, I mean." "Well," I smiled. "I'm glad I could provide that." He glanced at me, and for the first time, his expression softened.
"You didn't have to do any of this," he said.
"But thank you." Before I could respond, his gaze dropped, and I realized just how close we were sitting. There was a moment, a heartbeat, where the world seemed to pause. Then, almost instinctively, I leaned forward. Our lips brushed lightly, tentatively, and I pulled back just as quickly, my cheeks flushing in embarrassment. "Sorry," I stammered. I don't know what that was." His eyes met mine, a flicker of understanding, or was it amusement, passing across his face. "It's all right," he said simply. The tension eased as I laughed nervously. "Well, you're officially the most exciting thing that's happened to me all week." He chuckled, and for the first time since I'd met him, he seemed genuinely at ease. Glad I could help. As the minutes passed, the weight of the morning's events settled over us like a blanket. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much I didn't know about him. But one thing was clear, this was just the beginning. You picked the right place to visit, I said with a grin. I've got a shelf in the living room that's been hanging on by a thread for months. For the first time since he arrived, his smile seemed real. All right, he replied, rolling up his sleeves. Show me. I wasn't sure what I had expected when I guided him to the living room, but watching him assess the shelf with the kind of focus people usually reserve for life-or-death situations was oddly compelling. His movements were quick and practiced, his hands steady as he began to work. Looks like you've got a loose bracket here, he muttered, mostly to himself. Won't take long to fix. Take your time, I said, leaning against the doorframe with a casual shrug. I'm not in a hurry. As he worked, I couldn't help but watch him. There was something in the way he carried himself, quiet, deliberate, like he was trying to make himself as invisible as possible, while still being fully present. It made me wonder what kind of life he'd had before all of this. What had shaped him into the person standing in my living room now? After a moment, I asked, do you always fix things for people you don't know? Or am I just the lucky exception? He chuckled softly, his voice warmer than I expected. Let's just say I owe you one. Not every day someone pulls me out of the path of an oncoming car. I smiled, but there was a weight to his words that lingered in the air. It wasn't just about the accident. I wanted to ask him more, but before I could get the words out, he stood up and wiped his hands. There, he said, stepping back and surveying his work with satisfaction. Good as new. Impressive, I said, genuinely impressed. If you ever tire of moving around, you might want to consider a career as a handyman. He gave a half smirk, and for the first time, it felt like he was letting his guard down. I'll keep that in mind. The rest of the day unfolded with a strange ease. We talked about small things, where I grew up, what I did for a living, how I ended up in this quiet corner of the world. He listened intently, asking just enough to show interest, but never revealing much about himself. It was frustrating, but I didn't push.
Not yet.
Later, as we sat in the living room sipping tea, the conversation shifted. He asked about the old family photo on the mantel, a picture from years ago. They're back in the city, I explained. We're close, but I needed some space. This place felt like a fresh start. He nodded, as if considering my words. Sometimes space is exactly what you need. Then, after a long pause, he asked, is that why you've been moving around so much? I didn't mean to ask it, but the question slipped out before I could stop it. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared down at his tea like it held a secret he wasn't ready to reveal. Finally, he spoke. Something like that. Sometimes it's not about finding space. It's about escaping from it. The room fell into a heavy silence. I immediately regretted asking, but before I could change the subject, he looked up at me, his gaze soft but steady. Thanks, he said quietly, almost reluctantly, for letting me stay, for not asking too many questions. I smiled, though something tightened in my chest. Anytime. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to his story. Something he wasn't ready to share. But I knew better than to push. If he wanted to tell me, he would. After all, it wasn't every day a stranger turned your life upside down in the best way possible. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of the front door creaking open. For a split second, my heart caught in my throat, half expecting him to be slipping out without a word. But when I rushed out of my room, I found him standing in the doorway, staring out at the street with an unreadable look on his face. Couldn't sleep? Asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He glanced at me, then shook his head.
Just needed some air.
I'll be back. Before I could say anything, he stepped outside, the door clicking softly behind him. I stood there for a second, hesitating, but then something about the way he left nagged at me. I couldn't just wait for him to return, so I grabbed my jacket and followed. When I caught up with him, he was standing a block away, leaning against a lamppost, watching an older man dig through a trash bin. The man was weathered, his clothes tattered. I'd seen him around the neighborhood, but I'd never spoken to him. He's always here, I said, moving to stand next to him. Yeah, he said quietly, his voice distant. Looks like he could use some help. I nodded, already reaching into my pocket. Wait here, I told him, stepping forward before he could stop me. The old man looked up as I approached, his expression wary but curious. Hey, I said, offering a smile. I was wondering if you'd like something to eat. I've got a little cash, too, if that would help. He straightened up, brushing his hands on his frayed pants. I appreciate it, miss, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. But I've got something better than money. Before I could respond, he bent down and pulled something from the side of the bin, a guitar, battered and cracked down one side. At first, I thought he was joking, but then he sat down on a nearby bench and began to play. The first note cut through the air like the sun breaking through a storm. His fingers moved across the strings with a grace that didn't match his weathered appearance. The music was haunting, a mix of melancholy and hope that seemed to pour from him effortlessly. I stood frozen, completely captivated. Soon people started gathering. A woman pushing a stroller stopped to listen. A delivery man slowed his bike, then just stopped altogether. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around him. It felt like a concert had appeared out of nowhere. People clapped to the rhythm, some even swayed to the melody. One man pulled out his phone to record, while another tossed a few bills into the old man's guitar case. The man didn't miss a note. I turned to see my guest at the edge of the crowd. His expression was a mix of awe and something else, something deeper I couldn't quite place. When he caught my eye, he nodded toward the old man. I told you, he said softly. Some people don't need help. They just need someone to listen. His words stuck with me long after the old man finished his song. The crowd erupted into applause, and the old man gave a small bow before setting the guitar down on his lap. I stepped forward, still holding the money I had planned to offer him. That was incredible, I said, trying to find the right words. Where did you learn to play like that? The old man chuckled, his eyes crinkling with age. Life's a good teacher, miss, he replied, his voice rich with a lifetime of stories. Sometimes, when words fail, music is all that's left to speak for us. I handed the old man the money, and for a moment, he paused. I almost thought he might refuse it, but then he took it, slipping it into his pocket with a slight bow of his head. Thank you, he said softly. Not just for this, but for stopping. Most people don't. The crowd, which had gathered so unexpectedly, began to thin, people drifting back into their routines. But I stayed there for a moment, looking at him, still surrounded by the echo of his song. Turning back, I found my unexpected guest watching from a distance, his eyes trained on the street. As I walked toward him, he spoke without turning his head. You didn't have to do that. Neither did he, I replied, gesturing toward the old man. But sometimes, the smallest things make the biggest difference. We walked back to the house in silence, the air between us heavy with the memory of the music, the people, the unspoken understanding that seemed to hang between us. Once inside, he leaned against the kitchen counter, his gaze lingering on the floor as if lost in thought. That man, he said quietly, he reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone who could turn anything, pain, joy, fear, into something beautiful. Someone close to you? I asked carefully, not wanting to pry. He nodded, but didn't elaborate. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. You've got a habit of stepping into people's lives when they least expect it, don't you? I shrugged, trying to play it off, but I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. Maybe I just like surprises. He gave a faint smile, but it was different this time. Less guarded, more genuine. And for the first time since I'd met him, it felt like we were standing on the same ground, no longer strangers. Just two people, quietly carrying the weight of things that couldn't be spoken aloud. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind replayed the old man's song. How it had brought people together, how it had turned a quiet morning into something meaningful. It made me wonder how many other people in the world were walking around, carrying secrets and talents that went unnoticed. And it made me wonder what secrets my guest was still keeping from me. The next day started like any other, mundane, predictable. But as evening rolled around, something felt off. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the half-finished bowl of soup in front of me. My body felt heavy, my skin clammy, and there was a dull throb behind my eyes that wouldn't go away. You okay? His voice came from across the room, breaking through the fog of my thoughts. He was working on the kitchen cabinet, his hand steady as he tightened a hinge. I tried to brush it off with a weak smile. I think I'm just tired. I'll be fine after some rest. But I wasn't fine. As the evening wore on, my condition worsened. The lightheadedness intensified, and the room seemed to spin every time I moved. By the time night fell, I was shivering under a blanket, my forehead burning with fever. He must have seen the change in me because, by the time I let out a shaky breath, he was at my side. His voice was urgent. I think you need to call someone.
Now.
I'm fine, I muttered, though even I could tell I wasn't. He didn't argue. Instead, he stood up and crossed the room with that same calm certainty that I'd come to recognize in him. You're not fine, he said, crouching down so he was at eye level with me. You're burning up. I hesitated, but the dizziness was so intense now that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialing the emergency line. The operator was efficient, reassuring me that a doctor would be over shortly. I hated making a fuss, but I didn't have the strength to argue. When the knock came, he answered it. I heard low voices, a few muffled exchanges, and then the door opened. The doctor, tall and wearing dark blue scrubs, walked into the room carrying a medical bag. He was older, with kind eyes, but the sight of him still made my stomach twist. Let's take a look, the doctor said, setting his bag on the coffee table. He checked my temperature and then looked up at me, concern creeping into his expression. You've got a pretty high fever, he said. We'll need to bring it down quickly. I'm going to give you an injection. My heart skipped a beat. An injection? I croaked, feeling the panic rise. Is that really necessary? The doctor's expression was kind but firm. Yes, it's the quickest way to bring your fever down. Don't worry. It'll be over before you know it. I nodded weakly, though the knot of fear in my stomach only tightened. I'd never liked needles, never had, never would. Just the thought of the sharp point piercing my skin made my palms sweat. I glanced over at him, my unexpected houseguest, hoping to find some comfort. His eyes were focused on me, calm, steady. You can do this, he said, his voice low and soothing. It'll be quick. Then you'll feel better. I nodded, my grip tightening around the blanket, knuckles white with tension. The doctor prepared the syringe, and my breath hitched when I saw how large the needle looked. I couldn't help it. The words came out in a strangled whisper. That's huge. The doctor smiled, but it did little to ease my nerves. It's not as bad as it looks. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. I could feel the alcohol swab on my arm before the sting of the needle. It was too much. The panic, the pressure, the needle coming closer. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Are you sure there isn't another way? I asked, voice shaking. There isn't, the doctor replied gently. Just breathe. It'll be over soon. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart thudding in my chest. Then it was there. The sharp, cold bite of the needle, and I screamed, not from pain, but from fear, from the helplessness of it all. The doctor pulled the needle away, calm and professional. It's done. I opened one eye, then the other, realizing that the worst was already over. The sting had faded, leaving only a slight soreness in my arm. I let out a shaky laugh, my cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Sorry, I muttered. I might have overreacted a little. From across the room, I heard him chuckle softly. A little, he teased, though I could hear the affection in his voice. The doctor packed up his things, giving me instructions to rest and drink plenty of fluids. You should start feeling better soon, he said, before leaving with a final call if anything changes. The door closed behind him, and the house fell into an oddly peaceful silence. I stayed wrapped in the blanket, still shaken, but the fever was starting to subside. He sat beside me on the couch, his presence a quiet comfort. You are brave, he said, his voice warm but tinged with the same teasing edge from before. I rolled my eyes, unable to suppress the smile that tugged at my lips. Don't start. We sat there for a while, the tension of the evening slowly dissipating. I was still weak, but I felt the first stirrings of relief. The fever was breaking, and for the first time all day, I let myself relax, knowing that, for once, I wasn't alone. The house felt unnervingly still, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as he moved about. It was strange how quickly I had grown accustomed to his presence, how natural it felt to have him here, as though he had always been part of the rhythm of his house, this space I had tried so hard to fill with only myself. That morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. My feet barely touched the floor as I padded toward it, drawn by the familiar scent. When I entered the kitchen, I found him standing at the counter, his back to me, staring out the window as the first rays of light spilled through. The mug in his hand looked small and fragile against his grip, and his posture was heavy, like he was carrying something unseen that made him smaller, more fragile than usual. My chest tightened as I crossed the room. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely breaking the silence. He turned slowly, his gaze meeting mine, but it was distant, far away. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, with a deep sigh, he set the mug down with a soft clink on the counter. "I think it's time for me to go." The words hit me like a punch, sharp and final.
Go.
I repeated, my voice barely a whisper, as if saying it aloud might make it less real. He leaned against the counter, his arms folding across his chest, an unreadable expression in his eyes. "You've done so much for me. More than I deserve. But I can't stay here forever." I opened my mouth, wanting to argue, wanting to tell him that he didn't have to leave, that I wasn't ready for him to go. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, there was something in his eyes that stopped me. Something final. A quiet resolve. I swallowed hard, feeling the sting of unsaid words. "Where will you go?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering down. "I don't know," he admitted softly. "But I need to figure things out. Find my own way again." The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I helped him pack the few things he had, my hands trembling with every fold of clothing, every zip of his bag. We didn't speak much, and what was there to say? I didn't want to say goodbye, but I could already feel it hanging between us, pressing in on the spaces that had once felt so full of possibility. By the time we reached the front door, my chest felt tight, suffocating. My breath shallow. I could barely breathe, let alone speak. He turned to me, his voice soft but firm.
"Thank you."
"For everything." I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump that had settled in my throat. "Take care of yourself," I managed to say, though it sounded hollow, empty even to me. He hesitated, and for a brief second, I thought he might stay. But instead, he stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. It wasn't one of those movie hugs, no sweeping, dramatic gestures. It was simple, warm, real. His arms wrapped around me, and I let myself lean into it, feeling the weight of everything we'd shared in those few months. When he pulled back, his gaze lingered on my face, as if he were trying to memorize every detail, as if he knew this would be the last time he'd see me like this. "Goodbye," he said, his voice quiet, almost like a prayer. And before I could say anything, he turned and stepped out the door. I stood there in the doorway, watching him disappear down the path. The ache in my chest grew with every passing second. I wanted to call out to stop him, to tell him to come back, but I knew, deep down, I knew that nothing I said would change anything. It wasn't until I turned back into the house that I noticed the envelope on the kitchen table. It was small, folded neatly, my name scrawled across the front in his familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I picked it up, turning it over, my heart pounding in my ears. I opened it slowly, pulling out a single folded piece of paper. Inside was a sentence, simple but weighty, as if it had taken him a long time to find the right words. "You reminded me that there's still good in the world." Beneath the note was a small wooden figure, hand-carved, rough around the edges but unmistakably made with care. It was a tiny bird, wings outstretched as if ready to take flight. My fingers traced the contours of it, and as I held it in my hand, tears blurred my vision. He was gone, but had left behind a piece of himself. And for a moment, it felt like maybe it wasn't over. Maybe it was just the beginning of something I couldn't quite understand yet, something I wouldn't fully grasp until I was ready to let it. I stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, the bird held tightly in my palm, my heart both aching and full. The house, so empty only moments before, now felt like it had been touched by something greater than all of us, something that would stay with me long after he was gone.